Okay, so we've been exploring all the intellectual and theological turmoil across Europe. Today we're going to be looking at topic 9.7 in our challenge, our authority challenge unit, and look at why Europe turned outward. Right? There's all this conflict within Europe. Why are they taking this moment to really start striking out, exploring, conquering, and colonizing the rest of the world? So the goal here is for you to be able to explain why Europe turned outward by analyzing how that religious fragmentation we've been learning about, trade dependency that we've been talking about for a very long time, state consolidation, the growth of power of kings and monarchs, and economic pressure that's been building all push these European states to expanding overseas. You have to understand at this point, right? Again, Europe was divided. It was the farthest thing from united. They were at one point during the early medieval period united religiously, but now that's been fractured. The Protestant Reformation permanently shatters religious unity in Europe, and it's probably never coming back, right? Catholic and Protestant rulers are now competing for both legitimacy in the eyes of the people, and they're also fighting for survival, right? These kings used to use religion to justify their authority, but now that's not as easy as it once used to be. So religious wars are also starting to drain resources and destabilize populations as religion and politics become so intertwined, wars are being fought over it, and that's just draining the resources of everyone. Almost like maybe we should keep government and religion separate, an idea that's going to grow and eventually spill over into the age of revolutions, which is where we're headed next. But before we can get there, we have to understand that authority is no longer flowing from a single Catholic Church. Instead, it's flowing from competing states who are competing for legitimacy, authority, resources, religious belief, all this, right? And it's fragmenting, this fragmentation is increasing rivalry between these different kingdoms instead of producing peace between them, which is kind of what the Catholic Church tried to do. This is, of course, linked that structural vulnerability. Europe's authority structure is now very unstable because legitimacy is now contested between both governments and faith traditions, right? You can't just say, well, this is the way we've always done it. No, that's starting to change. You can't say it because God wants it, because then the question is being asked, well, according to which version of Christianity? And this internal stability is creating external pressure to expand, to get more resources, to show your version of Christianity, to show that your political power is better than everyone else's, and you can prove that by going out and doing these amazing things, conquering new lands and gaining wealth. Trade at this point had become very vulnerable, right? During the Pax Mongolica, Eurasian trade routes were relatively stable and connected, right? When the Mongol Empire was kind of united, you could travel pretty much all the way across Asia into Europe under one political rule, and so trade was stable. And European demand for spices, silk, and luxury goods from out east start to really increase during this period, and that's kind of the early to late medieval period. But the Mongol Empire itself had fragmented, had broken into different khanates, right? With the Huan dynasty over here, also known as the Khanate of the Great Khan, you got the Golden Horde up here, you got a couple other khanates, and so the Mongol Empire is kind of fracturing. And because of that, trade routes become less secure. There is still trade across the Silk Road, there's money to be made, so people, of course, are still going to be traveling west and east, but it's not as secure and safe as it once was. And then in 1453, the Ottoman Empire captures Constantinople and starts to control the eastern Mediterranean Sea region, right? This area was the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire shrinks. The Ottomans take over. Constantinople is taken over. And the Byzantines, the Romans, are gone. So European merchants who are Christian now depend on the Ottomans as intermediaries for connection to these luxury goods that go far into the eastern trade routes. The Ottomans are Muslim. The Venetian traders here in the Italian city-states, they're Christian. And so there's kind of this religious conflict going on. You can still get these resources, but essentially the Ottomans are going to be selling it to a higher price to the Venetians, who are then going to sell it to a higher price to everyone else, and everyone's kind of taking their cuts. So if you want these luxury items from out east, spices, silks, things like that, you're going to pay a much higher rate. If you could only find a way to cut Venice and the Ottoman Empire out and go directly to the source of these luxury goods, well, you could make a lot of money for yourself. And that's what European rulers start to think. Europe essentially at this point is relying heavily on trade systems that it doesn't control, right? The Venetian merchants and the merchants of the Italian states, they're controlling a lot of these trade routes. They've got exclusive deals with the Ottomans. They're charging high prices for all this. And demand for Asian goods are still remaining high, but the access to those goods depends on your political rivals and religious rivals. And so direct trade would mean better wealth, more prestige, and more power for your state. Essentially, if you could find a way to get access to those luxuries over here by getting around the Ottoman Empire and the Venetians, it would make your rule as king look stronger. It would make your version of Christianity seem more legitimate because, wow, look at the success that you're bringing to your people. It must be a blessing from God. And so they're all looking for ways to make this happen. And medieval religious warfare really is shaping this idea of expansion. The Crusades normalized religious warfares across centuries, as really you're fighting, right? The Crusades are from 1096 to 1204, not to mention the 800 years of the Reconquista. And so this idea of fighting wars based on religious ideas and expanding territorial control is pretty normal. And in 1492, the Reconquista in Spain is completed, unifies the Iberian Peninsula under Christian rule, although Iberia is split between the Catholic Christians of Spain and the Catholic Christians of Portugal, but they're no longer under the control of Muslims. Because of this 800 years of fighting, the Spanish rulers, the monarchs here, emerge highly militarized, right? They are used to fighting. They're used to having a strong, well-trained army with the best weapons available. They have a centralized command structure, and they're religiously confident. After all, this is a major victory kicking out the Umayyad Caliphate, and it must be a sign from God, they say. It's in that same year Columbus comes to the new king and queen of Spain and says, I have an idea to solidify your control, your prestige, and solidify the proof that God is shining down on this new kingdom by finding this way to the riches out east by sailing west. This expansion really can be framed as spreading of Christianity as well as gaining wealth, right? Both things are true. These monarchs are looking a way to gain money and wealth, but also to spread their version of Christianity to prove that it is the one true version of the faith. These governments, these states, need visible victories to reinforce religious and political legitimacy. After all, if they can win victory after victory after victory, they can claim that's a sign from God that their version of Christianity is the right one, and everyone else needs to convert to their version. And if you make a lot of money doing it, well, hey, that's even better. And because of all these changes happening in society, thanks to the humanist movement and the Renaissance, these governments across Europe now have the capacity to expand. Feudal Europe lacked centralized taxation and coordination, right? All the power was really fragmented across the different fiefdoms, but with the growth of these strong central monarchs who can tax and raise lots of money, they now have the ability to actually have the money to pay for these expeditions and to coordinate the massive resources necessary for these conquests and colonization of other areas of the world. By the late 1400s, the monarchs of Europe are consolidating this authority, this power, and creating revenue systems capable of paying for all this. And these stronger governments can now fund ships, soldiers, and expeditions. At the same time, there's advances in shipbuilding, navigation, and cartography, that is map making, which is reducing the risk. So more money is available to do all this at the same time that the technology is ready for it to happen. And it's important to understand the Europeans did not create this technology. They got it from other places and then adapted and improved upon it, right? The triangular sail pattern used in order so you're not dependent on the direction the wind is blowing is something that that was invented during the Islamic Golden Age. Navigation techniques, right? The magnetic compass comes from China. The astrolabe is coming from the Islamic Caliphate. Cartography, right? Maps of at least the East in Africa are coming from these trade routes further east as well. So Europeans are really building on this technology that others invented and taking it to that next level. And then the printing press, once these discoveries are made, is able to consolidate all this information and spread it quickly everywhere so everyone has access to it, which means if there's a discovery that Spain makes, soon England's going to know about it, and soon France is going to know about it, and Portugal's going to know about it, everyone's going to know about it, and they're going to want a piece of the action. These centralized governments that have all the power in the authority of these new strong monarchs now both have the money and the tools to expand, but stronger governments are going to require constant revenue to sustain the armies and bureaucracy necessary in order to control these large territories. They're going to win these big victories because of these armies and all this, but in order to continue to expand and to continue to actually control these areas that they're conquering, they're going to need a large bureaucracy to manage this massive empire. But those armies to defend those colonies and the bureaucracy necessary to run those colonies are themselves going to be extremely expensive, and that's going to put more pressure on them to continue to expand and grow. And of course, there's these economic incentives that are driving this decision to expand. Gold and silver are financing armies and strengthening states, but direct trade routes are also eliminating intermediaries, meaning if you can just control where that wealth is being generated, right, the resources, and all the trade route that it travels along, then you don't have to pay taxes and no one's going to charge you a higher fee, right? It's not buying from someone who bought from someone who bought from someone. Instead, you just control every step of the process. This is called mercantilism. Trade surpluses are going to increase national power and national prestige, right? Look how much wealth we have. States that don't compete, that fail to take part in this race of exploration, colonization, and exploitation of these areas, are going to risk falling behind their rivals. And if you fall too far behind, you're going to be conquered by them. So wealth translates directly into military and political advantage in this system. But it is important to remember that the Americas were not empty. The Aztec Empire controlled millions of people through tribute networks, fear, and belief systems, and the Europeans are going to have to deal with this when they get there. The Inca Empire is the largest empire in the Americas, and they controlled a massive territory through a centralized bureaucracy of their own and their religious belief system. Again, something the Europeans are going to have to contend with. Of course, the indigenous peoples all across North America have their own trade networks connecting regions across continents, their own power structures, and it's not like Europeans can just come and take everything. They're going to have to find a way to contend with these people who are already there in order to destabilize the systems that were already there so that Europeans can take advantage of all these resources. But these cultures in the Americas, right, their authority was legitimized through religion and military power, much like you're seeing over in Europe. But that, as we saw in Unit 7, this is all has their own structural vulnerabilities in place. And so you're going to have these two systems crashing into each other. These systems have these built-in vulnerabilities. So what happens when they're hit with political, economic, religious, and public health crises all at once? That's kind of going to destabilize and destroy all these systems that we studied in our pre-Columbian Americas unit. So the Europeans choose maritime expansion as their way to kind of grow their empires, right? They could expand by fighting each other, but they've decided instead to expand west across the sea. In 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, seeking an alternate route to Asia in order to get direct access to the riches there and bypass the Venetians and the Ottomans. But by 1494, both Spain and Portugal are sponsoring ocean voyages out west and east, and this is going to cause conflict. Now, both the Portuguese and the Spanish were Catholic, which means they're not fighting to show against each other, competing to show the legitimacy of their version of Christianity over the other ones. They're both Catholic, but they're also direct rivals because this isn't just about religion. This is also about prestige of the rulers, the monarchs, and wealth. So this competition for new lands is actually creating conflict between two Catholic kingdoms. To prevent war between these two new powerful kingdoms, the Pope steps in and negotiates a settlement between the two Catholic monarchs, and this is called the Treaty of Tordesillas. It's essentially what it does is it creates this imaginary line down the globe on the map, right? They're having better cartography skills here, and essentially the treaty says, according to the Pope, anything east of this line, the Portuguese are free to claim for themselves. Anything west of that line, the Spanish are free to claim for themselves. And this kind of does explain why Brazil, for example, which is right here, they speak Portuguese, not Spanish. And the Portuguese start to colonize the coast of Africa and the monsoon marketplace over here, the Swahili coast, India. All this starts to be taken over by the Portuguese, whereas the Spanish start to conquer all these pre-Columbian cultures that we've been studying, which explains why Brazil speaks Portuguese and all these areas speak Spanish. You have the Pope stepping in order to stop conflict between two Catholic monarchs. So the Catholic Church still has a lot of power, a lot of juice that it can still call upon in order to play its hand and play a role in global politics. And with the Portuguese and the Spanish quickly colonizing and controlling large sections of the world, this is going to also increase the number of Catholic worshippers, which is going to further increase the power of the Catholic Church. Not to mention, right, the tithe, that 10% tax the church gets, that's going to drastically increase the wealth of the Catholic Church. And if you're looking at religiously or theologically, right, it's the Catholics who are making these first great steps into the New World, conquering all these areas, and it is kind of seen by some as, well, maybe the Catholics are right. After all, they're doing all this, so God must be having their backs. Spanish conquistadors start to exploit the divisions in the American empires, and this was made easier as native populations were devastated by European diseases. For 10,000 years, the peoples of North and South America have been isolated from Africa, Europe, and Asia. Diseases are freely flowing along trade routes between Africans, Europeans, and Asians, and so there's some immunity, right? It's still devastating to these populations, but immunity is growing. But by all accounts, Native Americans in North and South America and Central America have not been exposed to these diseases. They have absolutely no immunity, no natural defenses, and it kills them off by the millions. Think how destabilizing this is, right? The labor force is destroyed. Your justification for power, right? Your sacrifices to the gods or your rituals are no longer doing what they need to do, right? People are dying, and therefore people are losing faith in that, which means they're losing faith in their political leaders. Trade routes get destabilized from this. You can see how this is going to be devastating, and diseases spread faster than the Europeans, so even before European armies can get to a lot of these places, they're already devastated and weakened by the diseases that came, that basically was the tip of the spear. And all the silver and gold wealth of the Americas are now flowing into Europe. As wealth flowed, so did crisis. Silver mines and sugar plantations become the pillars of European wealth. The Europeans cannot get enough of sugar, and these plantations expand into Brazil and the Caribbean, and massive land has to be cleared in order to grow just nonstop fields and fields and fields of sugarcane. This is very labor intensive. But also, once a lot of the gold and silver that's just kind of freely on the ground or at the surface level is, eaten up and used all up by the Europeans, well, they're going to need to mine deeper and deeper for it, and they're going to need a large labor force to do that as well. The plantation economy in particular depends on large, stable labor forces that no longer exist locally because so many of the natives are dying off from disease. And economic expansion now depends on replacing that lost labor with other labor populations, right? Native Americans are dying off. You got to find someone else to do the work. Are you going to bring Europeans in to do it? Or are you going to find another labor source? Well, it turns out European settlers were few in number. Yes, people were moving from Europe into the Americas, but not by the thousands, or not nearly enough to meet the labor needs of these plantations and mines. So they just aren't bringing the labor from Europe necessary at the scale needed. Colonial profits are really requiring you to have a large, reliable labor force. And this is when Europeans turn to a new source of labor, slavery, namely enslavement of Africans. The Age of Exploration was not just about curiosity, it was about convergence, right? Yes, Europeans were curious about the rest of the world. This curiosity was sparked by the Crusades and what the Crusaders saw when they traveled out east, but it really was a convergence of many, many, many events coming together. Europe is turning outward because the Ottomans controlled limited direct access to Asian trade that Europeans wanted. Mediterranean commerce was dominated by Italian middlemen, which were charging higher prices to make a profit, which funded the Renaissance. Religious fragmentation across Europe intensified rivalry between different governments trying to prove their version of Christianity was the right one in order to justify the rule of their kings. Monarchs are consolidating power into their hands, right, away from the nobles into the hands of the monarchs, and they're requiring a lot of money in order to man these massive armies and control these large bureaucracies necessary to control large territories. At the same time that's happening, technology is getting into Europe and being kind of, because of these trade routes, because of large urban centers, because of the humanist movement, they're improving on technology that's lowering the risks of long distance expansion. So all this is happening at once, and that's pushing these Europeans to expand, to explore, expand, and conquer and colonize all these areas. Medieval trade competition also plays a role in this, right? There's religious conflict between different sects of Christianity, different versions of Christianity trying to prove themselves. Centralized state power is emerging into nation states where now kings are justifying the rule not just based on God, but also on, well, our people who share a common history and culture should have a monarch that reflects that, which is creating a different basis for their authority, which is going to have consequences of its own. Technological improvements are happening, and economic pressure is happening to produce more and more wealth to pay for all this. And as all of this converges at once, how can they keep that wealth flowing? To do that, well, they're going to turn to enslaving over 10 million people from Africa over a 250-year period. It is a terrible legacy that we're going to start exploring. Okay, that's the end of the lesson. We're going to be exploring a little bit more of this as we go into our next couple lessons. But for now, rewrite that goal, type out those 3 facts. Don't copy and paste, guys. Stop and think for yourself. And write out one question you still have about this narrative, about this lesson, about this unit. Really anything related to these topics so that you can show me your thinking and just show that intellectual curiosity. All right, until I see you again, have a good one.